Look, what I'm about to share with you might completely shift how you see your own vulnerability and your hidden power. Most empaths spend years believing they're doomed to attract narcissistic abuse, but Jung discovered something that changes everything about this dynamic. There's a profound psychological mechanism at work here that goes far deeper than what mainstream psychology teaches. When Jung was working with individuals who repeatedly found themselves in these devastating cycles, he noticed something remarkable. These weren't weak people. They were actually operating from an incredibly sophisticated emotional intelligence that had been weaponized against them. Here's what fascinated me about Jung's observations. The very qualities that make empaths vulnerable to narcissistic manipulation are the same qualities that, when properly understood and integrated, make them absolutely untouchable. We're talking about a complete psychological transformation that most people never achieve because they're too busy treating symptoms instead of addressing the underlying psychic structure. Jung worked extensively with a patient who had endured 3 consecutive relationships with narcissistic partners. Each time, this individual blamed themselves for being too sensitive or too trusting. But Jung saw something different. He recognized that this person possessed what he called transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing psychological forces in consciousness simultaneously. The problem wasn't the gift itself, but how it was being unconsciously deployed in service of unresolved inner conflicts. Real talk. This insight completely revolutionized my understanding of empathic psychology. What Jung discovered was that empaths don't attract narcissists because they're weak. They attract them because they're unconsciously seeking to heal their own shadow through these toxic dynamics. The empath sees the wounded child beneath the narcissist's grandiose facade and believes they can love them back to wholeness. But here's where it gets really interesting. Jung identified that this pattern stems from what he termed the savior complex, a psychological defense mechanism where empaths attempt to resolve their own inner conflicts by rescuing others. The narcissist, operating from their own unconscious wound, instinctively recognizes this pattern and exploits it with surgical precision. The empath's unconscious message broadcasts something like, "I need to be needed in order to feel worthy." The narcissist's unconscious responds, "Perfect. I need someone to blame for my emotional dysregulation." This creates what Jung called a psychological constellation, an unconscious pattern that draws these 2 wounded archetypes together like magnets. Between you and me, most therapeutic approaches completely miss this deeper dynamic. They focus on boundary setting and self-care, which are important, but they don't address the fundamental psychological structure that creates the vulnerability in the first place. It's like putting a band-aid on a broken bone. It might provide temporary relief, but it doesn't heal the underlying fracture. Jung's approach was radically different. He understood that true protection comes not from building walls, but from achieving what he called psychological differentiation, the ability to remain emotionally present without losing oneself in another's psychological chaos. This isn't about becoming cold or disconnected. It's about developing genuine psychological sovereignty. When an empath achieves this differentiation, something extraordinary happens. They retain all their natural sensitivity and intuitive gifts, but they're no longer unconsciously seeking completion through others. This creates what Jung described as psychological immunity, a state where external manipulation simply cannot penetrate because there's no unconscious hook for it to grab onto. I've seen this transformation happen, and it's profound. The empath doesn't become cold or disconnected. They become radiantly authentic. They can still feel others' emotions, but they're no longer compelled to fix, save, or absorb them. This shift creates an energetic signature that actually repels narcissistic personalities because there's nothing for them to exploit. The narcissist's entire strategy depends on finding psychological fractures, places where someone's sense of self is fragmented or incomplete. When they encounter genuine wholeness, their manipulation techniques simply bounce off like water off a duck's back. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like in real relationships. Imagine an empath who has achieved this psychological sovereignty meeting someone with narcissistic tendencies. The narcissist begins their typical pattern: the love bombing, the subtle manipulation, the emotional dependency creation. But something's different. The empath remains warmly present, but psychologically unmoved. They don't get swept up in the intensity or feel compelled to rescue or fix. This response is deeply disturbing to the narcissistic personality because their entire strategy depends on finding someone who will unconsciously collude with their psychological drama. When they encounter genuine psychological wholeness, they instinctively recognize that their manipulation won't work here, and they typically move on to find a more suitable target. Here's what blew my mind when I fully grasped this. The empath's transformation doesn't just protect them from future abuse, it actually breaks the cycle of attraction itself. They stop unconsciously broadcasting the psychological frequency that draws in wounded, manipulative individuals. But this gets even deeper. Jung discovered that empaths who achieve this sovereignty often experience what he called psychological magnetism. They begin attracting emotionally mature, psychologically developed individuals who are drawn to their authentic wholeness rather than their unconscious wounds. The key insight here is understanding the difference between empathy and emotional codependency. True empathy is a conscious choice made from a place of psychological strength. It's the ability to feel with someone without losing yourself in their experience. Codependent empathy, on the other hand, is an unconscious compulsion driven by unresolved inner conflicts. Most people can't distinguish between the two, which is why they remain vulnerable. Honestly, this distinction changed everything for me. I realized that what I had been calling empathy was often just unconscious emotional fusion, a desperate attempt to feel whole by merging with others' experiences. Jung worked with another individual who perfectly illustrated this dynamic. This person described feeling empty when alone and alive only when involved in someone else's emotional drama. They had unconsciously learned to use others' emotions as a substitute for their own authentic feeling function. This created a psychological addiction to emotional intensity that made them irresistible to narcissistic personalities. The transformation process involves what Jung called withdrawing projections, recognizing the parts of yourself that you've been unconsciously seeing in others. For empaths, this often means acknowledging their own capacity for manipulation, control, and even narcissistic behavior. Now, I need to share something crucial with you. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it requires facing some uncomfortable truths about yourself. Many empaths resist this process because it means acknowledging that they've been unconsciously participating in these toxic dynamics. But this acknowledgement isn't about blame, it's about reclaiming your power. Jung worked extensively with individuals who had to confront this difficult realization. He found that the resistance to taking psychological responsibility often kept people trapped in victim consciousness, which paradoxically maintained their vulnerability to future abuse. If you're still with me, it means you're ready to explore territory that most people avoid. The journey from empathic vulnerability to psychological sovereignty requires what Jung called shadow integration, the willingness to face and embrace the parts of yourself that you've been unconsciously rejecting. For empaths, this often means confronting their own unconscious aggression, their need for control, and their hidden sense of superiority. Yes, you read that correctly. Many empaths carry unconscious superiority complexes that manifest as the belief that they're more emotionally evolved than others. This unconscious arrogance actually creates the perfect setup for narcissistic manipulation. Here's what's crazy about this dynamic. Narcissists are unconsciously drawn to this hidden superiority because it mirrors their own grandiose self-image. They sense a kindred spirit in the empath's unconscious belief that they're special or chosen to save others. This creates a psychological dance where both parties are feeding each other's unconscious wounds. The empath thinks, "I'm so evolved and compassionate that I can heal this wounded person." The narcissist thinks, "Finally, someone who recognizes my specialness and will cater to my needs." Both are operating from unconscious grandiosity, which creates a toxic feedback loop. Jung called this phenomenon psychological inflation, when someone identifies with an archetypal energy rather than integrating it consciously. The empath becomes inflated with the healer archetype, while the narcissist becomes inflated with the king or queen archetype. Neither is relating from their authentic human self. The path to becoming untouchable involves what Jung termed enantiodromia, the psychological principle where things transform into their opposites when taken to extremes. The empath who has been excessively focused on others' needs must learn to honor their own psychological requirements. The person who has been overly accommodating must develop healthy aggression and boundary-setting abilities. But here's the sophisticated part. This isn't about becoming selfish or closing off emotionally. It's about achieving what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox and complexity without collapsing into either extreme. You're probably starting to see patterns in your own life right now, and that's exactly what we want. Recognition is the first step toward transformation, but it's also the most challenging because it requires radical honesty about your own unconscious motivations. Let me share 4 specific manifestations of how this transformation unfolds in real relationships, because this is where theory meets practice. First, consider an empath who previously would have felt compelled to explain themselves endlessly when confronted with emotional manipulation. They would engage in circular arguments, trying to make the other person understand their perspective, essentially feeding the narcissist's need for emotional drama. After achieving psychological differentiation, they simply state their position once and refuse to engage in these energy-draining exchanges. They've learned that authentic communication doesn't require convincing others of their worth or intentions. The key insight here is that the compulsion to over-explain comes from an unconscious belief that you're responsible for others' emotional reactions. When you integrate this shadow aspect, you realize that everyone is responsible for their own psychological state, and attempting to control others' perceptions is actually a form of manipulation. Second, imagine an empath who used to absorb others' emotional states as if they were their own responsibility. They would walk into a room and immediately start adjusting their behavior based on the emotional climate, unconsciously trying to manage everyone's feelings. In their transformed state, they can witness someone's pain with compassion while maintaining clear psychological boundaries. They offer support without feeling obligated to fix or rescue. This transformation requires developing what Jung called conscious suffering, the ability to allow others to experience their own psychological processes without interfering. This doesn't mean becoming callous. It means recognizing that everyone has their own path of psychological development, and your attempts to shortcut their process often creates dependency rather than genuine healing. Third, picture an empath who formerly interpreted others' emotional intensity as a sign of deep feeling or authenticity. They would mistake drama for passion and chaos for creativity. With developed discernment, they can distinguish between genuine emotional expression and manipulative emotional display. They respond to sincerity and remain unmoved by emotional theatrics. This discernment comes from understanding what Jung called psychological types, the recognition that different people process emotions in fundamentally different ways. Narcissistic personalities often use emotional intensity as a form of control, creating artificial urgency and crisis to keep others off balance. The transformed empath recognizes these patterns and doesn't get pulled into the drama. Fourth, and this is where it gets really personal, consider an empath who previously felt guilty for having their own needs and desires. They had unconsciously learned that their worth depended on self-sacrifice and putting others first. After achieving sovereignty, they recognize that honoring their own authentic needs is not selfish. It's psychologically essential. They understand that they cannot genuinely give to others from an empty well. I bet this next example is going to feel eerily familiar. Jung worked with someone who described a pattern where they would meet someone and immediately feel an intense connection, as if they had found their person. This feeling was so compelling that they would ignore obvious red flags and rush into deep emotional intimacy. Later, they would discover that what they had interpreted as soulmate connection was actually psychological enmeshment with someone who mirrored their own unconscious wounds. The transformed empath learns to distinguish between authentic connection and psychological projection. They develop what Jung called differentiated feeling, the ability to appreciate genuine compatibility while remaining grounded in reality about the other person's actual character and behavior patterns. This requires understanding what Jung called the anima and animus projections, the tendency to unconsciously project our idealized masculine or feminine images onto others. Empaths are particularly susceptible to these projections because their sensitivity allows them to pick up on others' potential, which they then mistake for their actual current reality. Jung discovered that these projections serve an important psychological function. They point toward qualities we need to develop within ourselves. When an empath finds themselves repeatedly attracted to charismatic but emotionally unavailable partners, They're unconsciously seeking to develop their own inner authority and self-containment. The sovereignty process involves recognizing these projections and consciously developing the qualities you've been seeking in others. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming whole by integrating all aspects of your personality rather than seeking completion through external relationships. This is probably hitting close to home right now, and that's exactly what we want. The discomfort you might be feeling is your psyche recognizing patterns that have been operating unconsciously. This recognition is the beginning of liberation. What I'm about to share with you is the practical framework Jung developed for this transformation, what I call the sovereignty protocol. This isn't just theoretical knowledge, it's a systematic approach to rewiring your psychological patterns at the deepest level. But before we go there, I need you to understand something important. The information I've shared so far represents years of studying Jung's most profound insights about empathic psychology. Most people never encounter this level of depth because it challenges comfortable assumptions about victimhood and personal responsibility. Between you and me, the psychology establishment doesn't want you to know this because it undermines the victim-perpetrator narrative that keeps people dependent on external solutions. When you achieve psychological sovereignty, you no longer need someone else to validate your experience or protect you from manipulation. If you're serious about this transformation, then we need to go deeper together. The framework I'm about to share requires commitment and courage, but it's also the most direct path to psychological freedom I've ever encountered. The sovereignty protocol operates on 4 distinct levels: shadow integration, psychological differentiation, transcendent function development, and archetypal embodiment. Each level addresses specific unconscious patterns that create empathic vulnerability. Shadow integration for empaths involves confronting what Jung called the inferior function, the psychological capacities you've been unconsciously rejecting. For most empaths, this means developing healthy aggression, learning to prioritize your own needs, and acknowledging your capacity for manipulation and control. This sounds harsh, but it's actually liberating. When you stop projecting these qualities onto others and own them consciously, you reclaim tremendous psychological energy that was previously bound up in unconscious dynamics. I wish I could see your face right now as these pieces start connecting. The moment you recognize your own capacity for the behaviors you've been condemning in others, you stop being unconsciously controlled by them. The shadow integration process involves what Jung called active imagination, a technique where you dialogue with the rejected aspects of your personality. For empaths, this might mean having conversations with your inner narcissist, your inner controller, or your inner victim. These parts of your psyche contain valuable energy and wisdom that becomes available when integrated consciously. Jung discovered that the shadow contains not just negative qualities, but also positive potentials that have been repressed. Many empaths have unconsciously rejected their own power, ambition, and self-advocacy abilities because they were taught that these qualities were selfish or unspiritual. Reclaiming these shadow gifts is essential for developing psychological sovereignty. One of Jung's patients described a powerful active imagination experience where they dialogued with their inner tyrant, the part of themselves that wanted to control and dominate others. Initially, this conversation was terrifying because it revealed how much rage and aggressive energy they had been suppressing. However, as they continued the dialogue, they discovered that this inner tyrant contained valuable qualities like determination, strength, and the ability to set firm boundaries. The practical application of shadow integration involves daily self-observation and honest inquiry. When you find yourself judging someone harshly, you ask, "How am I like this person? What quality in them am I rejecting in myself?" This practice gradually dissolves the psychological projections that make you vulnerable to manipulation. Psychological differentiation is the process of learning to maintain your psychological identity in the presence of others' emotional states. Jung discovered that most relationship problems stem from what he called psychological contamination, the unconscious merging of psychological contents between individuals. Empaths are particularly susceptible to this contamination because they mistake emotional fusion for intimacy. True intimacy, however, requires 2 psychologically differentiated individuals who can remain themselves while being authentically present with another. The practice involves developing what Jung termed conscious participation, the ability to be fully present with someone's experience without taking it on as your own. This requires mastering the paradox of being simultaneously open and boundaried, receptive and sovereign. Here's where it gets really personal. Most empaths have been unconsciously using their sensitivity as a defense mechanism, a way to control their environment by predicting and managing others' emotional states. This creates an exhausting cycle where you're constantly monitoring and adjusting to others' moods, rather than living from your authentic center. The differentiation process involves learning to tolerate what Jung called psychological tension, the discomfort of allowing others to have their own experiences without interfering. This means sitting with your impulse to fix, save, or rescue while choosing to remain present but non-reactive. Jung worked with individuals who practiced what he called emotional boundaries visualization, a technique where they would imagine a permeable but protective energetic boundary around themselves. This boundary allowed them to sense others' emotions without absorbing them. They would practice this visualization daily until it became an automatic psychological response. Another powerful differentiation technique involves what Jung called conscious breathing, using breath awareness to maintain your psychological center when confronted with others' emotional intensity. When you feel yourself being pulled into someone else's emotional state, you focus on your breath and ask, whose emotion is this? What belongs to me and what belongs to them? The goal isn't to become emotionally numb or disconnected. Rather, it's to develop what Jung called differentiated empathy, the ability to understand and feel with others while maintaining awareness of your own distinct psychological boundaries. Transcendent function. Development is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Jung's approach. This involves cultivating what he called the symbol-forming function, the ability to create new psychological solutions by holding opposing forces in conscious tension. For empaths, this means learning to simultaneously hold compassion and discernment, openness and boundaries, sensitivity and strength. Most people collapse into one extreme or the other, but psychological sovereignty requires mastering paradox. The practical application looks like this. When confronted with emotional manipulation, instead of either shutting down completely or getting pulled into the drama, you maintain what Jung called creative indifference. You remain present and responsive while staying anchored in your own psychological center. This creates what I can only describe as psychological magic. People sense that you're fully present but completely unmanipulatable. You become someone who can be trusted with others' vulnerabilities because you're not trying to fix, save, or control them. The transcendent function allows you to respond to situations from a place of creative spontaneity rather than unconscious reactivity. You're no longer limited to the old patterns of either accommodation or rebellion. You can find third options that honor both your needs and the reality of the situation. Jung described working with someone who mastered this function during a particularly challenging relationship dynamic. When their partner would become emotionally dysregulated and start blaming them for various problems, instead of either defending themselves or taking on the blame, they would say something like, "I can see you're in pain right now and I care about you. I'm not going to accept responsibility for problems that aren't mine, but I'm here to support you in finding constructive solutions." This response neither rejected the partner's experience nor took on inappropriate responsibility. It held the paradox of being simultaneously compassionate and boundaried, which often had the effect of de-escalating the conflict because there was nothing for the manipulation to hook onto. Archetypal embodiment is the final level of the sovereignty protocol. This involves what Jung called conscious relationship with the archetypes, learning to channel archetypal energies without being possessed by them. For empaths, this often means developing a conscious relationship with the healer archetype, rather than being unconsciously identified with it. When you embody the healer consciously, you can access its wisdom and power without being compulsed by its shadow aspects. The shadow of the healer archetype includes the savior complex, the need to be needed, and the unconscious arrogance of believing you know what's best for others. When these shadow elements are integrated, the healer becomes a powerful ally rather than an unconscious driver. Jung worked with individuals who learned to invoke different archetypal energies depending on what the situation required. Sometimes they would embody the warrior archetype to protect their boundaries, sometimes the sage to offer wisdom, sometimes the lover to connect authentically. This archetypal flexibility creates tremendous psychological resilience because you're no longer limited to one way of being in the world. You become what Jung called a conscious personality, someone who can choose their response based on what serves the highest good rather than what satisfies unconscious compulsions. The practice involves developing relationships with various archetypal energies through meditation, active imagination, and conscious embodiment exercises. You might spend time each morning connecting with your inner warrior to strengthen your resolve for the day, or invoke your inner sage when facing difficult decisions. One of Jung's insights was that archetypal energies become problematic only when they possess us unconsciously. When we relate to them consciously, they become powerful resources for navigating life's challenges with wisdom and authenticity. All right, here's where I tie everything together for you. The journey from empathic vulnerability to psychological sovereignty isn't just about protecting yourself from narcissistic abuse. It's about reclaiming your authentic empathic gifts and using them from a place of strength rather than unconscious compulsion. When you achieve this transformation, you don't lose your sensitivity. You gain conscious control over how you deploy it. You become what Jung called a wounded healer, someone whose own psychological integration allows them to genuinely serve others without losing themselves in the process. The framework requires daily practice and unwavering commitment to psychological honesty, but the results are extraordinary. You become untouchable not because you've built walls, but because you've developed genuine psychological immunity to manipulation and exploitation. I'm about to give you the roadmap I wish I had years ago. The daily practices that support this transformation are both simple and profound. They involve consistent shadow work, regular differentiation exercises, ongoing archetypal dialogue, and what Jung called ethical confrontation with your own unconscious patterns. The shadow work consists of daily inquiry into your projections and judgments. When you find yourself having a strong reaction to someone, you ask, what aspect of myself am I seeing in this person? This practice gradually withdraws your projections and reclaims your psychological energy. The differentiation exercises involve practicing emotional boundaries in low-stakes situations. You might practice stating your preferences clearly, saying no without justification, or allowing others to experience disappointment without rushing to fix it. The archetypal dialogue involves regular conversations with the different aspects of your psyche. You might journal from the perspective of your inner warrior when you need to strengthen boundaries, or channel your inner sage when facing difficult decisions. The ethical confrontation practice involves honestly examining your motivations and behaviors. When you catch yourself manipulating a situation or trying to control someone's response, you acknowledge it without self-judgment and choose a more authentic response. Jung emphasized that this work must be approached with what he called religious attitude, not necessarily religious in the traditional sense, but with deep reverence for the profound nature of psychological transformation. This isn't self-improvement, it's soul work that requires dedication and respect. The integration process typically unfolds in stages. Initially, you might feel disoriented as old patterns begin to dissolve. You may experience what Jung called therapeutic regression, a temporary return to earlier psychological states as your psyche reorganizes itself around new patterns. This is followed by what Jung termed the transcendent function emergence, moments when you spontaneously respond to challenging situations from your new level of integration rather than your old reactive patterns. These breakthrough moments build upon each other until the new way of being becomes your natural response. The final stage involves what Jung called psychological maturation, a stable integration of all aspects of your personality that allows you to navigate relationships with wisdom, authenticity, and unshakable inner sovereignty. Look, after everything we've explored together, you have a choice to make. You can continue operating from the same unconscious patterns that have created vulnerability in your relationships, or you can commit to the deep psychological work that creates lasting transformation. This isn't about quick fixes or surface-level boundary setting. This is about fundamental psychological restructuring that changes how you show up in every relationship for the rest of your life. If you're ready to take this seriously, then your next step is clear. You need to begin the shadow integration process immediately. Start by identifying the qualities you most judge in others. Those are precisely the aspects of yourself you need to consciously reclaim. I just poured my heart into sharing this with you, revealing insights that took me years to understand and integrate. The question now is whether you're willing to do the work required to embody this transformation. Are you willing to commit to this level of psychological development? Because half measures won't create the sovereignty you're seeking. This work demands everything, but it gives you back your authentic power in return. The choice is yours, but choose consciously. Your future relationships and your psychological freedom depend on the decision you make right now.